Gazing into our crystal ball and determining the 2026 first and second rounds in ADP. Where will people be drafting guys 1 year from now? That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn just told me the Zero RB countdown is coming out this week. He's working on it. This is our most anticipated show of the year. I've been asked about it several times. And so obviously we're going to have an absolute blast with this. We've done this for, I think, 5 years now, Shawn, where a couple weeks before the start of week one, we predict what we think ADP will look like for 2026 redraft this time next year, which factors in a whole bunch of things. And it doesn't entirely depend on our opinion. It depends on a little bit of our opinion on how the market will view a variety of potential outcomes. It does depend on our opinion in terms of us thinking through who's going to actually dominate this season well enough to finish in those ranges. We've talked for years, Shawn, about a draft tactic and strategy of trying to find players at all rounds that could jump, well, in the early rounds that are going to still be going in these ranges in the next year, and in the later rounds who could jump into the first and second rounds of redraft the following season. And so when you're in the 7th round, you're thinking about a guy who, hey, could this guy feasibly be a top 2 round pick next year? I wrote about a draft strategy article over at Stealing Signals a month or so ago. I called it like a 4 quarters thing. We talked about it on the show a little bit, kind of broke down drafts into different ranges. It was loosely based around this idea as well. And so you're kind of thinking about, how can I get players that perform in what I was calling the first quarter, which is sort of the first 2 to 3 rounds of drafts, these really elite players. Again, this is what we're trying to find. Guys that have ADPs all throughout the draft, but that can finish in this range or be in this range next year, which in some cases you're going to have an age element. It is tough for players, even if they have great years, to stay up there. And so that's a little different than the production. Derrick Henry had a great year last year. He's not a first rounder this year. That's just part of it when you're a 30-plus-year-old running back. At the same time, there's a really, really fun exercise to think through and test how much you think these guys' ceiling outcomes can really meaningfully come in and where that would push them into the next year. Tight end premium format, because it's fun to talk about where the tight ends might fit in as well. And so we like to use the format that bumps them up a little bit. PPR. And Shawn, it is so good to be back doing this with you. I'm excited for the 2025 version.
This is the most fun. And Ben, it's always fun too when we can come back and say that probably last year's exercise helped. Now, I won't in any way try to portray it as we somehow saw the future and got everything right. We know that that is not the case. But I mean, Brock Bowers does show up on our list. We did do a super flex one that we may do later in the offseason. Jaden Daniels was the 101 for both of us. I mean, he's not quite at that point, but foreshadowing that season and what he would accomplish was a lot of fun. Then when we look at last year's and we think through some of the fun names in this season, one of the things we talked a little bit about was that you had Bijan and Breece Hall at 1-2 last year. I started off with 5 consecutive wide receivers. I'm kind of checking this against the current FFPC redraft ADP, and it is interesting in that, I mean, there are elements of both of the things that work, but I certainly think that your running back heavy start was, and not heavy start, but the main guy, Bijan Robinson would be up there at the top. It's also interesting that Bijan was able to do it without having a standout season. You talked about this combination of talent and youth and looking forward. Now, I say didn't have a standout season. He didn't have one of these 23, 24, 25 point per game years, and yet he was certainly good enough that when you combine what he's done in the past, his prospect profile, and the outlook the people are still willing to take him at the very top of drafts when you have this full PPR element, and he is expected obviously to catch quite a few passes. When you look at these names at the top, I thought that Justin Jefferson would be the 101. He obviously hangs in again without having a great season. I talk all the time about how I think that he's the best wide receiver in the NFL. We both had Jahmyr Chase in the top 5 picks. The other one that I want to mention before I throw it back to you to see if you have anything else that you want to dive into in great detail on last year is that we both had Malik Nabers in the first round and didn't have Marvin Harrison factoring in nearly as early.
Yeah, that's a fun note. We had him at 9 and 10, Amon-Ra at 9 and 10. You and I remember this now, that from 8 to 11, we had the same names. We both had the same 8, which was Christian McCaffrey, and the same 11, which was Trey McBride, which we were pretty much nailed both of those. And it's kind of fascinating on McCaffrey because he got injured and missed so much of the season that he's basically going around 108 in tight end premium right now. And this was us. He was the 101 last year. This was us saying he's going to fall back because he's a year older, but probably expecting more production last season. And yet he'd still be the 108. And without any production, that's where he's going. Neither of us has Saquon here. We weren't particularly high on him to do what he actually did. But Nabers and Amon-Ra there makes sense. McBride at pick 11 makes sense. You mentioned I had the 1-2 RBs. I started Bijan and Breece Hall. Breece Hall, the exciting RB2 discussion between Bijan and Breece last year. Obviously, not the way that things progressed for Breece Hall. There's a lot of examples here of things not necessarily going the way that we anticipated. You mentioned having Justin Jefferson first overall. We redo this in season every year. I had Jefferson first overall in season, so that gives you a little bit of an idea of how things had progressed. You and I both had Jahmyr Gibbs in the first 5 picks of the second round. And then in season, I had him RB1, you had him RB2. And this was before David Montgomery had really missed any time. This was Gibbs just as part of the tandem early last year, already looking like maybe the most talented running back in the league and so dynamic that we were feeling really good about the way he would progress the rest of 2024, which he did. Again, Jahmyr Gibbs' biggest 2 games were in week 18 in a game for the division. And then in their playoff loss, he had 2 monster games. It didn't count for fantasy last year. There's a reason that you and I are both so high on him this year. And I think this in-season exercise where we both had him ranked in the top 9 for the next season, and both of us were very wide receiver heavy in season, which a lot of times this ends up happening. And I think it's pretty fascinating as well. We both did have Saquon by this point in our discussion, but back to the preseason stuff, I think it's so fascinating to see some of the hits and some of the misses. You mentioned, some of the names there. You have Brock Bowers at 107 in the preseason version of this. I had him at 211, and I'm just proud that I had him on the list at all. But I had him as my tight end 4. There was a lot of good young tight ends. We thought last year Laporta, we both had in the second round. You had Kincaid in the second round. I had Pitts in the second round. It's a reminder of how the elite tight ends were viewed last year. And certainly we were high on some of these guys, maybe higher than others. And it didn't necessarily pan out in a massive way. We both had Xavier Worthy in the second round. He's somebody who's not quite going that high, but if you look at Sean's rankings, maybe he should be, right? So there's a lot of elements here from last year that are very instructive and interesting and fun. You can definitely go back to last year's episode and listen to it and listen through all of our discussions. I think it's always really fun to go back to last year's, but we don't want to spend too much time on last year's because we obviously want to talk about this year's and start revealing what we did, what we landed on, where we differed, where we are similar. And the thing that we do here, so to let everyone know, anyone who's maybe new or doesn't remember, we do tight end premium format. And Shawn, you and I make a point to not look at each other's stuff here. We just drop it into a spreadsheet, hit record, and talk through the similarities, the differences, and what we think is fascinating. I've tried to lead it through sort of pick by pick over the years, but we're going to bounce around and all of those things. There's immediately stuff that I am so fascinated by. Our 112 is the same player. I'm going to hint at that already, and I'm fascinated to get to that when we get to the back end of the first round. There's a player I have at 109. You have in the first half of your second round that we're going to talk about on this first round episode. The next episode will be the second round, but we will wind up mentioning him because I have him ranked in the first round. That I'm excited to talk about with you as well. There's a player you have at 102, and you typically always kind of do have somebody at 102 that is exciting and fun. Last year it was Garrett Wilson. So I think in past years it's been huge hits for the record. But last year I had Garrett Wilson 106. We were obviously very high on Garrett Wilson's ability to do some fantastic things last year that didn't necessarily pan out. And he's in a different situation this year with Fields and all those things. Still going in the third round. It's not like he's fallen off the face of the earth or anything. The 101 for both of us in the tight end premium, probably no surprise. We both believe that Brock Bowers is going to do enough this year to be the 101 in tight end premium next year. The way we've talked about it recently, I want to get your thoughts on it. The way that I've said it recently is I think if he hits something like the 70th percentile of his range of outcomes, that he may be a guy that is in the 101 for the next half decade. I don't even think he needs to hit the 90th percentile to do that. I think his profile to this point is just so good and so productive at every year of his collegiate career and the rookie season. You have a 4-year, this is that long view thing where people are just looking at the rookie year. They're comparing it to Pitts' rookie year, Laporta's rookie year. Those guys didn't have 3 years of college production like Bowers. We have such a different 4-year trend for Bowers than any tight end ever. By a mile. I mean, like genuinely by a mile. Travis Kelce did not have the collegiate production. He had an injury in his first rookie season. No tight end has ever been anywhere near where Brock Bowers is entering his second season. Purely from the rookie production alone, which Bowers was way more impactful than, Pitts or Laporta's. The fact that he had over 100 catches and had more receptions in a season than any rookie receiver of all time. But then also when you think about the 3 productive years in college, what do you think about Bowers at the 101?
I have these dreams where he puts up a 400-point tight end season, gaps everyone else. Now, there was a little bit of weirdness in terms of how they utilized him in the second week of preseason that maybe has folks a bit nervous. There are a couple of things on this. First, I would just say that it makes sense to be aware of some of those things. I'm not saying that any of that analysis is bad, but I do think that specifically in preseason, teams have objectives that they're trying to accomplish that are very different than what you're trying to accomplish in the regular season, which is win games, right? You have this very first play where, he runs a long sideline pattern. The ball is thrown perfectly by Geno Smith, which is a big difference from what he was dealing with last year, but he is vaguely covered. He rises up and then he levitates and makes a beautiful hands catch over the defensive back. If not for a couple of the catches that Mitch Tinsley had last night, this Bowers catch, and not that it was a highlight even exactly, it was just the superhuman athleticism for a tight end that made it stand out to where, I mean, this was the most noteworthy play of the entire preseason for me. Now, again, you have to be careful about having something that you believe really strongly, and then you just take all of these individual pieces of anything that goes in that direction. You're like, yes, more and more and more, and you get more exaggerated in terms of what you think will happen. But part of the thing with Brock Bowers is just that the floor is incredibly high. If he has a bad season, he will still be a fine first-round pick. He's one of the only guys where I look at him and we assume, general health for the entire first round, or like a bad season and he is still a good piece of your roster and you can win with him.
So Trey McBride had an incredible catch in preseason week 1. Got you pretty hyped on Trey McBride. Am I hearing that Brock Bowers' big catch in preseason week 2 is working back the other direction?
One of the things I just want to mention on both of these guys, I do think that they are different from players like Travis Kelce and Rob Gronkowski, Jimmy Graham. It doesn't mean that they're going to have all of the same elements of scoring, because you look at those 3 situations and those guys had this range of like 10 to 20 touchdowns that you could easily just throw them into every year. You don't have that with Brock Bowers in this Raiders offense, even with Geno Smith. You certainly don't have it in the Cardinals offense with Kyler Murray being a very limited passing quarterback. Now, Kyler Murray has gone through some stretches in his career where he scored a ton of fantasy points, and he's gone through some stretches where he actually threw the ball pretty well. We haven't really seen that in the current iteration of the offense. He doesn't, I mean, they move the ball pretty well with the Cardinals. They have a very good run scheme. They do have a decent amount of talent. So they move up and down the field, but Kyler Murray does not look like a dynamic passer. You also have some concerns that they're going to really try and get a lot of touchdowns for James Conner and maybe even Murray himself. You contrast that again with these tight ends of the past, and like the touchdown element is a problem for both Bowers and McBride. And this also shouldn't come off as any like huge criticism of Kelsey and Gronkowski, because criticizing those guys in any way, shape, or form would be utterly absurd. They are elite to levels that, I mean, they're the two greatest tight ends in history. Even thinking through what guys like Antonio Gates and Tony Gonzalez did. But you think through all of those players and the ability of Bowers and McBride to separate and elevate gives them this wide receiver element that, again, it's so special, it's so unique. They're utterly different than the other players. Even someone like a George Kittle, who maybe is more dynamic after the catch, just incredibly athletic. He doesn't have that same, I don't know. I don't want to say anything bad about George Kittle. The point here is that the top tight ends are so good that if you're not looking at them differently, you're probably hurting yourself.
Love that note. And the way, as you were talking through that, you're talking about the ways that a lot of the older tight ends scored. I guess this is going to sound like a negative comp, but it's a player who had some incredible seasons, including a 110 catch season, 3 others of at least 94 catches. The guy I'm referencing is Jason Witten. He didn't always have the massive TD rates, but he was really good in PPR for that stretch. It would be Jason Witten, but with more athleticism after the catch and those things, because Witten wasn't necessarily a dynamic player with the ball in his hands. But it's a little bit like how Jason Witten would score in his prime. All of those years I mentioned, 4 of 6 years from 2007 to 2012. If you weren't playing fantasy back then, Jason Witten was a really, really good fantasy tight end in that stretch. Even his lowest season was 79 catches in that span, 81 another year. For a tight end to have an 80 catch floor and 110 catch ceiling over a 6-year span is massive. And then we're talking about, potentially more efficiency in addition to that. But Witten never had double-digit touchdowns in a single season in his career. Still had seasons where he was clearly the tight end one. I think 2010 was one of those such seasons. So anyway, Brock Bowers, especially in tight end premium, when you talk about that type of profile, is our 101. We'll get to McBride, who does factor into this first round discussion. For one of us, not quite. The 102 for me, I'm going to start because I have a 102 that you have at 104. I have the 102 I have is ranked higher on your side than your 102 is on mine. And that's Jahmyr Gibbs. We both have him as the RB1. He is not currently the RB1 in ADP. There is a concern about overall workload. There's a concern, I think, about how size and those things can factor in. And obviously with David Montgomery still being a big part of the offense. But as we look ahead to 2026, the things that Jahmyr Gibbs can do so dynamically and what we anticipate he can do throughout the season. We talked about Gibbs a lot, Shawn, this season already on the show. I just talked about it when I was talking about how we had him ranked in season last year and how interesting I thought that was. We both have him as the RB1 this time next year. Any major thoughts on Gibbs?
No, I mean, you've got this Jamal Charles element. You have the speed back, the receiving back, who, I mean, he's been much better than advertised. And that's despite the fact that he was advertised at a very high level. He's been better than advertised as a pure runner. He's broken more tackles. He's showed more intuitiveness in tight spaces. And when you can do that, and then anytime that you get to the second level, you're a threat to take it the whole way. It'll be interesting to see how much the coordinator change matters, if at all. I think that's going to be fascinating over the first month for the Detroit Lions. Does it mean that David Montgomery gets less work? Does it mean that the offense is less explosive? The reports out of Chicago Bears camp have really been very negative about Caleb Williams, about the offense's ability to even line up and successfully get plays off. That doesn't mean that Ben Johnson was some sort of mirage, that it was all Dan Campbell, that it was all incredible playmakers. And you get a little bit of the flip side of that, where in preseason week 2, then the preseason is just so hard to evaluate because teams are not playing their actual guys. But based on the practice reports, you would have to imagine that the Bears would have had a harder time in preseason week 2 if the Bills didn't have defenders on the field. I mean, they have been worse against air than they were against the Bills backups. So
Bears catching some strays as we talk through Jahmyr Gibbs.
But no, I mean, they were fantastic against the Buffalo Bills. And so, some of these teams are really bragging about their depth. The Denver Broncos right now think that they have the best team in football, and not just with starters, right? But they're going to be able to annihilate people. You look at the Kansas City Chiefs and the Buffalo Bills and what they're doing, they can't really make the claim, at least, that their third teams are good, because their third teams are absolutely awful. So then as we think about this whole piece together, I don't know that we necessarily have too much of a sense of what the Lions are going to look like, other than they're probably going to mostly look like themselves, and Jahmyr Gibbs is going to look like himself, and he's the best running back in football. Unless you somehow have an epic collapse, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to score in a way that not only is he the most dynamic player in 2025, but he'll be the guy people are most interested in and most excited about in 2026. My question for you, is it going to be to the extent that people have him above Ja'Marr Chase?
And that is the next name that we got to go to for sure. I still have Ja'Marr Chase as the wide receiver 1, but I have him 4th, in part because I do think we're going to see a little bit more of a tier separation, or the potential for a tier separation at running back, where there's a lot of really good receiver names. I think we're running into this issue this year as well at the top of drafts, where Chase is going 101. I do think there's a little bit of an element with Ja'Marr Chase this year where going into last season, he was actually falling down the first round in some cases. He didn't have a monster 2023. I think we all knew where the talent was. 2024 was incredible for Ja'Marr Chase. There's a little bit of an element here that's similar to CeeDee Lamb the year prior, where coming into 2024, basically everybody had him as the wide receiver 1 because he had the monster 2023. And you're talking about, I think Chase is on a different level than Lamb, to be clear, if you really look into the peripherals and the numbers and the long view. And Lamb took a little bit longer to progress to elite production in the NFL. He's in his prime. He's incredible. But my point is, I think there's a lot of different receivers that can have that type of season this year. And we're going to get to one that you have ranked 102. So Ja'Marr Chase, you have at 103, but he's actually your wide receiver 2. It's interesting. You have him a spot higher than me. He's my wide receiver 1. I do still think Ja'Marr Chase is going to have a great year and be viewed as the overall top wide receiver. But I think what happened with Lamb last year is a little bit instructive of the type of things that can push guys down. And Lamb's value has fallen somewhat this season because he was banged up last year and his quarterback got hurt and some of those things. I do think the 101 that Chase has sat at all year this year so definitively is probably a little bit of an overvaluation, if I'm being completely honest, at least from the perspective that I think it's flat. I think he's a part of a tier with people behind him, not clearly in a tier of his own. Having said that, the way that you've said it is the same way that I feel, and I think this is why he's stuck at 101 is everyone who gets the 101 wants exposure to Ja'Marr Chase. And so in all of these like best ball contests and all these things, people are taking Ja'Marr Chase at the 101 to make sure they're building some Ja'Marr Chase teams. He's a scary player to not have exposure to. The point I'm making is just that the definitiveness with which he's been ranked at the 101 all season is probably not reflective of him being in a clear tier well above everyone else, especially from a talent perspective. Certainly a situation elevates him even more with Burrow and with the pass rate and all those things, but talent perspective relative to a Justin Jefferson or a lot of these other guys that are incredibly talented players as well. But it could be Malik Nabers this year. It could be a number of guys, Nico Collins, right? Puka Nacua, if he hits his ceiling. The other guy that it could be that could elevate all the way to be the new wide receiver 1, and Shawn, you have ranked at the 102 ahead of Ja'Marr Chase. So as I kick it back to you to ask you about Ja'Marr Chase, I want to certainly get your opinion on this 102. You've been getting higher and higher on him as we've progressed. You've got me more excited. There's a lot about the situation that got me really excited while doing the projections that I would definitely like to mention. You're more of a profile-based drafter. You're very, very into Brian Thomas this year, and you see him as the 102 next year, ahead of Chase at 103. Explain.
He's just the next guy, right? We have this situation with Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson. They're on the same college team. Jefferson is a little bit overshadowed. He comes out, and if anything, it becomes fairly clear that he's a slightly better NFL player. They do things a little bit differently, but basically Jefferson is Chase with slightly bigger body, better at the catch point, probably more nuanced in his routes, probably a bit tougher. I mean, Ja'Marr Chase has the ultimate level of explosion, and Ja'Marr Chase has the better quarterback. And that's one of the reasons why I think Justin Jefferson is very tricky to value this year. You go then and you think about, well, what does that mean for Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas? And I put a piece out recently that was looking at Jackson Smith and Jigba, and sort of peripherally some people like Jerry Jeudy, but looking at the biggest and most impressive yard per route run seasons in college, which they were the combination of these seasons where you had insane yards per route run while at the same time having like top 15 teammates, and in some cases multiple first round receiving teammates, and you were able to still do all of these things. Obviously guys like Chase and Nabers show up there because they were able to do those things with Jefferson and Brian Thomas in tow. Then you look at what happens as those guys are rookies, and it becomes, I think, at least to me, increasingly clear that Malik Nabers would be that other guy who's up there with Chase and Jefferson from a pure talent perspective, the ability to draw targets and then the ability to run after the catch and basically just be larger the entire NFL. In some ways, Nabers is like Chase and Jefferson put together. But Nabers, and this is one of the things that we, got a decent amount of pushback on, or at least some interesting questions, right, in the Reddit AMA. That was a lot of fun. I mean, Malik Nabers is a massive injury risk. You then look at what Brian Thomas did, and especially what he did in the second half of last season, where you can make the claim that he was one of the 3 or 4 best wide receivers in all of football, maybe the best non-Ja'Marr Chase receiver in the second half of his rookie year, while playing in a bad scheme and catching passes from Mac Jones. And one of the things that you get is that same thing that you get from Chase, where you have the ability to draw the underneath targets and run, and you have the ability to get over the top. And it's not just that you do those two things, but you do them at such an extreme level that the yards and touchdowns are going to come almost regardless of who you have. Then you put him into this new environment where you probably have an above average coordinator, maybe an elite coordinator, and an offense that we watched last year do things like funnel targets to the stars and amplify the fantasy value of the best players on the team. And those guys were not Brian Thomas. Right? He's a full level, if not multiple levels above those types of. And then you watch early in the preseason, and you're like, he's going to draw a target on darn near every play. And what Travis Hunter is going to be able to do is keep defenses a little bit honest. I mean, people have what I think is a legitimate concern. There are some scenarios in which the season plays out and Travis Hunter is so good that Brian Thomas almost gets pushed back into the role that he was in at LSU or into the role that T. Higgins is in with the Bengals. I'm not saying that's impossible, but you watch again what Brian Thomas has done and what he's been as a touchdown scorer over the last couple of years, what he was as an athlete. I mean, Ben, he may be the best athlete at wide receiver in the entire NFL. And now everything is set up perfectly for him on a team that probably will still be bad and need to be in shootouts. I mean, he's the next 400-point fantasy wide receiver.
Big words there. One of the biggest notes that I referenced the situation. One of the biggest notes that I took, probably the most interesting stat that I felt that I found through my projections process. I'm certain I've shared it on the show, but was that Liam Cohen, in his time last year as the coordinator, I mean, it's interrelated stats, but the way that I would say it most directly is both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin had their best yards per out run of their career, despite career low ADOTs. And lower ADOTs tend to it correlates with yards per target, tends to bring down the yards per target because you're just catching the ball closer to the line of scrimmage. You have to really have a higher catch rate. We know that catch rate correlates with lower ADOTs, but you have to have a way higher catch rate and add yak and those things. And they were, to me, it's just clear evidence that Liam Cohen was able to scheme his two best wide receivers into space and get them the ball. For Godwin, he's had a lot of low ADOTs, like when he was playing with Tom Brady and stuff, and they were even below that. He's this very low underneath ADOT, but a lot of catch and run opportunities. He's having a great year when he gets injured on a per out basis, career best yards per out run. For Evans, he's always had an above average ADOT. He's been like 13, 14 yards of depth downfield. The average around 11. Last year, he was around 12. So he was still above average, but brought down, which I think that average was brought down by what we saw. A lot of scheme stuff, more time in the slot, more ability to get him open for some easy catches underneath. And that led to a higher catch rate and then more overall efficiency. So that he, in a long career where he's had 1,000 yards every year of his career, had the best yards per out run of his career. And if you don't remember back to the early Mike Evans seasons, his yards per out run were fantastic because he was fantastic. He was drawing massive volume in whatever it was, year 2 or year 3, when he was the overall wide receiver 1. I think it was year 3. He had a huge targets per route and a huge yards per target and a huge yards per out run. Even better last year in this offense at a lower ADOT. And that part of it, to me, very fascinating. The interrelated thing was Baker went from a 9 ADOT in 2023 under Dave Canales, which was a good enough coaching job from Canales to get him a head coaching job. Liam Cohen takes over, and Baker's ADOT goes from 9 down to, I think it was 7.3. His completion percentage goes from a good 64% around a deeper ADOT of 9 up to a great 71% at this lower ADOT. So Baker was throwing a lot more underneath, not just to Evans and Godwin, but a lot of it was this ability. It didn't mean entirely underneath. That's why I shared Evans' actual depths. Brian Thomas is still going to get vertical pass attempts in this offense, but the ability to get these high success rate plays in the lower areas through scheme to your best players, very favorable. And that's basically exactly what I've thought all along Trevor Lawrence is needed, as a coach who could rein him in a little bit. He's always pushing the ball downfield. That's the thing I've loved to see in the preseason, is he's been able to complete some passes to these wide receivers underneath. I haven't seen the second preseason game for these guys yet, but the first one, he hit Brian Thomas on the first throw, short of the sticks, quick, easy throw into space. He hit Travis Hunter on multiple throws underneath. And I agree with you, the way that Travis Hunter can play into Brian Thomas. In the rest of this depth, Jahmyr Brown looks interesting, but not a big target earner. Brenton Strange, not a target earner. There's no one else on this roster that looks like they're going to earn meaningful targets. Even if Hunter is a hit, it's probably 2 guys getting all the volume, which again is what Liam Cohen showed he's able to do from a scheme perspective. And so there's not really a cap on Thomas. There's a little bit more of a cap on Hunter from the perspective of routes, that he may play some defense in those elements. Thomas seems to be the guy that they're really going to rely on. I put him at 106 as my wide receiver 3. I think going through this exercise, I was thinking similar, that you give a guy that efficient the opportunity to get this much volume, he has the potential to really climb. Now, the player that I had ahead, so your top 4 was Bowers, Brian Thomas, Ja'Marr Chase, and Jahmyr Gibbs. My top 4 was Bowers, Gibbs, and then at 3, I took another running back, Bijan Robinson, who you have all the way back at 111. We'll have to discuss that. And then Ja'Marr Chase was my number 4. The guy I had ahead of and then I mentioned I had BTJ at 6. The guy I had ahead of BTJ was Malik Nabers at 5. And this, I think, is an interesting one from the perspective of what we're trying to do with this exercise and how we're trying to do it. It's a difficult thing to do. I know that if Malik Nabers didn't have a massive toe injury that's been an issue throughout August, that I would guess that you would have had him much higher than 109. We're going to interpret things differently as we go through this exercise. You talked about him being a major injury risk. I'm going to take the other stance on Nabers, which is to say that however good you think Brian Thomas is, Malik Nabers was meaningfully better at LSU. And even if Brian Thomas never takes a second fiddle role at the NFL level, as you kind of talk through, some people, including myself, have talked about the potential that Hunter is just better and becomes the Nabers to Brian Thomas in their LSU days. I don't actually think that's the way that it's going to play out in the early seasons of their careers as they overlap here, based on Thomas already establishing so well in year one, and based on Hunter's workload and the defensive element. I think he's going to play more receiver than people think, but I do think that is going to limit his ability to immediately ascend in a way that Thomas has already sort of ascended. And so he's not just going to be one season ahead, maybe a season and a half ahead in terms of his wide receiver development. And that's going to be probably pretty helpful in terms of his ability to continue to not become just the second fiddle, like the T. Higgins, if you will, in your discussion. But Nabers was the guy who did render Brian Thomas a little bit of a second fiddle in college. Now, that doesn't mean everything, because every scheme's a little bit different, all that stuff. We saw that, Ja'Marr Chase sort of rendered Justin Jefferson a little bit second fiddle while they were at LSU together. Justin Jefferson arguably has been better in the NFL, at least on par. And so we've seen a different type of production from the two of them at the NFL level than maybe how they immediately matched up in college. Maybe the better comparison there is Landry and OBJ. That was one of the knocks on OBJ. And OBJ in the early part of his career was so good in the NFL. All of these LSU combos, right? But Brian Thomas ahead of Nabers, I feel like, is a bit of a hot take. And I figure it's mostly all injury related for you. For me, I put Nabers all the way up to 5. This guy had 170 targets last year in 15 games. There's one player in the entire NFL, Ja'Marr Chase, who had more targets, and he played 17 games. Malik Nabers led the NFL as a rookie in targets per game meaningfully, does not have any target competition. People are way out on Wan'Dale Robinson, who was the guy who got 140 targets because somebody else needed to get targets in this passing game. He's got even less competition than what I just described for Brian Thomas. If Nabers is at all healthy, he's going to have an absolutely monster season. I'm willing to bet through it. This is a toe injury they've talked about going all the way back to his collegiate years. There's talk now that it's scary, that it could be career altering, etc. They knew about it when they drafted him. They knew about it last year. I guess I'm fading it a little bit, and maybe in a scary way, but the ceiling is worth it. And all these players have a lot of risk, but the way that Malik Nabers' profile manifests, especially now that you get him a quarterback that can actually throw downfield. We were talking, John, before the show, just before we recorded this, the Colts announced Daniel Jones as a starter. Daniel Jones can't throw the ball down the field. I mean, we were kind of talking through. He had a really hard time with that throughout his time in New York. And you were mentioning to me that he missed Tyler Warren on a deep shot in preseason week 2. That's part of the Daniel Jones experience. He was able to do the stuff underneath pretty consistently and rack up a lot of volume there for Nabers, but the efficiency for Nabers wasn't as good in year 1 as it should have been. And I pretty much chalked that up entirely to QB play, because then he also played with Drew Lock and Tommy DeVito and these guys, Danny DeVito, whoever it was back there. He's got Russell Wilson and Jackson Dart now, who are much better deep ball throwers. If Wilson's not good enough, then Dart's going to take over, and that's what Dart does well. Or, I mean, if Jameis Winston plays, he's probably even better for Nabers than either of those two, because the way that he's such a gunslinger. I mean, I'm a little concerned that Wilson's not going to be perfect for Nabers' profile, but I do think in some, the quarterback scenario is going to be very, very good. The target competition, very, very weak, and Nabers still very good at separating and getting open and drawing volume. I think he's still got to be ahead of Brian Thomas. And so I have him at the 105. I have BTJ as my 106. Bijan, my 103. You have those guys, Nabers 109 and Bijan 111. A little further back in your first round as we wrap up the front half of my first round. Talk about what kept Nabers and Bijan out of the front half of your first round.
For Nabers, it's just purely that injury risk. I'm not that concerned about the quarterbacks. Russell Wilson, the thing he can do is throw that deep ball, and supposedly that connection before Nabers had to start sitting out some of these practices was in full form early in camp. It does look like Jackson Dart is positioning himself to be the starter sooner rather than later. He can probably hit all the throws that you need from Nabers. And so if we're talking about a guy finishing as the overall wide receiver 1, that sets up perfectly. If you have some rookie, learning curve types of moments, he's just going to lean on his absolute superstar even more. The total number of targets, the target share, anything that you want to look at from a target generation perspective, Nabers should crush anytime he's out there on the field. Notice for that, I didn't say healthy because he wasn't healthy last year and he crushed those things anytime he was out there. And then you have the after the catch element. I've had him as the pretty clear number 3 overall player behind Jahmyr Chase and Brock Bowers for most of the offseason. But this additional sort of back injury on top of the toe injury, on top of the fact that some of these things now appear to be chronic, I think when you're putting him back at 109 behind guys like Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb, that's fine. Those guys are so good
Yeah,
that
yeah,
if you're
yeah.
going to reside
It
behind
is.
them, it's okay. For Bijan Robinson, I think in part for me, he's a victim of how deep I think this first round is, and that I think he's not a star. We look at what he did last year. He doesn't average 5 yards per carry. I mean, that's okay, but it's
He's over
4.8
4.5.
is 4.8 is fantastic, but it's not what Barkley did. It's not what Henry did. It's not what Gibbs did. You look at his evasion rate, it is very good. It's actually definitely quite a bit better than Saquon Barkley and Jonathan Taylor, who is the other back with more yards per game on the run side than he had last year. Robinson did do fine from a fantasy points over expected perspective on a per game level because he scored a lot of touchdowns. I think that in some ways, though, we have a tiny bit of a talent ceiling for Bijan Robinson, which is a weird thing to say because he was the guy, maybe more than any of the other backs, who came in the last 15 years with, I mean, the generational tag. And it was almost a little bit in terms of the floor being insanely high. And I think that that is what we're seeing. I think the floor is very high. I think he's a safe pick. I think he's going to score a lot of points. The Falcons are probably going to move the ball, and they don't have other pieces other than Tyler Algier. So that part isn't great for him, but probably also doesn't matter. I think that we're just going to see another very good season from him, that when people are looking at other options like a Gibbs, like a Genty, like these receivers, they're thinking structurally and tactically, Bijan Robinson is a very good pick, but isn't a
Yeah.
must-have. He maybe shouldn't be going in the top 5. But maybe they'll just look at it like they did this year, which is like, why wouldn't you get that floor of like 21 points per game? And obviously it's not his actual floor, but when you think through the different scenarios for Robinson, very clean, very high floor, and then you can do a lot of things building your team out from there. So
And if he
if
hits on a
he
few
has
more
another solid
explosive
season,
runs, the big issue, the reason I ranked him up there is the big issue for his yards per carry that you reference is he has not had a 40-yard run in his career. And that's been something we've talked through, that explosiveness matters big time for being able to actually score in a meaningful way. The workload's going to be really, really strong. And I guess, Shawn, I would guess that he will have a couple 40-yard runs this year. That would be surprising if it took another season for him to not do that. He's an explosive runner. And Michael Penix really opened up the run game for him in the final 3 games. When Penix was starting, Bijan had 90-plus yards and 2 rushing TDs. 90 plus on the ground and 2 rushing TDs in all 3 games. One of them, he had like 150 plus. I think it was his biggest rushing yardage game of the year. 3 really strong rushing games because he suddenly had a quarterback that could attack the deep intermediate and soften up the defensive secondary a little bit, give him some room to run in that second level. I think he's going to have a few more explosive runs this year. I do think he is a good top 5 pick this year. I like the way that you described it as a possible risk and concern for Bijan. And in that scenario, I think you said it, you closed it very well. It's not that he would be a bad pick. You still have him at 111. One of the extra elements of this exercise this year is we've talked all year about the first round this year extending well into the second round, 16, 17, 18 names in tight end premium. You're talking about a lot of guys that can fit into the first round discussion for the next season. And so when Bijan Robinson's at 111, you're not saying he's bad. You said at the end, he's a very good pick, but maybe not one that you have to push other great picks out of the way for. And I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. Let's talk about your number 5. You have Brock Bowers 101, Brian Thomas 102, Chase 3, Gibbs 4. You've got Justin Jefferson at 6. I have him at 8. We have Ash and Ginty at 7 each. So I'm kind of getting a little ahead, but those are guys that people are probably like, where do they land? Well, this is where they land in this next range. 105 is the next big discrepancy. You have Trey McBride 105. I have him 201. So even though you have Bowers at 101, you've got McBride as an additional top 5 pick. I love him as well, Shawn. Absolute superstar. I love this take. I think even having him at 201 with Bowers at 101, for me, I was prepared to give this take that they both separate this year from everyone. And Bowers is still so good that he's the 101, but McBride also is just showing that he's so clearly the tight end 2 that if you don't get a chance to draft Bowers at 101, you also got to take McBride when you get an opportunity to. I originally had him later in the first round. I ended up pushing him to 201 because of some of the other guys that I moved into the first round. You've got him all the way up at 105. You think this is going to be a 1A, 1B at tight end this year?
Yeah, you look at Trey McBride, he scored 299 points in tight end premium last year, played in 16 games. The only player who scored more points and didn't play in the full 17 was Saquon Barkley. You can look at that from a per game perspective, and Trey McBride last season scored more points per game, very marginally, than Justin Jefferson. He scored more points than CeeDee Lamb.
And he didn't score any touchdowns.
And yes, and that's the final point, is he did it without touchdowns. Now, you can say maybe they don't do those same things. Maybe this is the absolute peak season that he gets. It is, pretty amusing when you go in there and look at the receiving numbers for Bowers and McBride. And again, we have to consider that they're in different parts of their career arc. But you have 9.1 targets per game for both guys, 6.6 and 6.9 receptions. They're both between 70 and 72 yards. They both averaged 7.8 yards per target. They were between 54 and 57 air yards. They were between 32 and 36 yards after the catch. Their racers are identical until you get out to the hundreds where they're off by 2. Neither of them scored. Trey McBride had more trouble scoring. And again, you watch these two guys play, they separate by so much. I just don't think that you can. There are other things you can do to address receiver and running back, and you can get, not exactly lucky, but you can do it with bulk, where you have a lot of guys who are going to crush their ADPs and build that part of your lineup out in that way. I'm not saying that there's no chance that Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland won't elevate to where they were the clear play and do that same thing for you at tight end. I'm not saying there will never be another breakout tight end. We're going to get more good players, but the value that Trey McBride gives you, and I think the caliber of player, to me, is just the only players that I can justify putting above him for this season are those other 4 guys. Justin Jefferson, because of the QB play and because of the presence of Jordan Addison, slots in there for me at 106. That's how good I think Trey McBride is. Tight ends have been a little bit risky, in part because the specific guys who dominated fantasy, like a Rob Gronkowski, got hurt a bunch. If we get clean careers from Bowers and McBride, and by that relatively clean, don't miss a ton of games over the next decade, they're going to rewrite all of the history books.
Yeah, I think that's the key there. And I like your rank more than mine. As you talk through that, you talk about the spot that McBride scored at last year relative to the receivers without the touchdowns. I'm ranking Bowers 101, you're ranking Bowers 101. We're doing that because of this idea. And I think there's a clear underlying trend here that's actionable for 2025, that all the concern about elite tight end structures and the ways that things have gone in the past, people are going to view very differently this time next year, because these guys are going to distance in a way that there is going to make them the right picks in the early rounds. And it's going to be undeniable that you can take a tight end this high. That's the way that these things move in fantasy. You need a use case a lot of the times. It's hard for people to see what it means. And so you get a discount on Bowers and McBride this season. And then when we see it the next year, people go back to 2022 when Travis Kelce had the 100-point gap in just regular PPR over every other tight end. The next year he was going like 105 or 106. And that's when he was old, right? He's progressing out of his prime. The next year he's still going very high. And people are like, I don't know if he still got it though, even though he had this great 2022. And he did fall off a little in 2023. And then because of age in 2024 last year, he's going further down, and then this year in 2025, even further down. And that was inevitable at his age, the way that would happen. But in 2023, coming off how much he gapped the field in 2022, and it being fresh in everyone's mind, how an elite tight end can be that type of a win rate player. He was a clear top 10 pick in all formats, even at that age. We get that type of season from Bowers and McBride. People get reminded that tight end is a place with a lower replacement level floor, and a bigger potential to really gap everyone else when you have these massive ceiling seasons and the points are there. For Bowers to be 101, you have to have that phenomenon and people to get comfortable from a market perspective with that change with tight end. And if they're comfortable with that, then McBride's going to go 105. There's no way there's going to be a gap. I can't have Bowers 101 and McBride 201. It doesn't even make sense as far as the way that the market is working. Either they understand this thing fundamentally about tight end or they don't. And I mean, it could happen if McBride just doesn't score very well, I guess. And Bowers really gaps even McBride. But I like the way that you did it. I think it makes more sense intuitively about how the market will respond and what it tells, the story that it tells about 2025 and what these elite tight ends are going to mean. So that's your number 5. Justin Jefferson, your number 6, you mentioned. I have him 108. I think a little caution here from both of us. New quarterback. And then also, as you said, respect for Jordan Addison, who is an incredible player from whatever it was, week 8 or week 9 on. Final 9 games or something. It was a stat I shared when I did the projections. 80 targets for Jefferson, 70 for Addison. I got that stat because you were talking about it in real time last year when I was wanting to not start Addison every week and you were trying to get me started. You're like, Ben, go look at the volume. Jordan Addison is getting as many targets as Justin Jefferson right now. Addison, year 2, age 22 season last year, really took off in the second part of the season. Doesn't mean he's going to steal from Jefferson, but there are so many dynamic players in these early ranges. It is meaningful. And so the reason I had him at 108 behind Nabers and BTJ is because Nabers and BTJ to me do not have a Jordan Addison on their offense. BTJ has Travis Hunter, obviously, but he's going to play some defense. He's got to develop more. Addison's going into year 3 and is further along than what Hunter will be for BTJ. And obviously doesn't have the defense element as well. And so I think that's a very important element when you're thinking about how good all of these receivers are at the top and where the competition comes in and what that means for just how much volume they can earn. A guy that we will get to that I would use as an example is like Puka Nacua. Once Cooper Kupp really started to fade late last year, Nakua's per route run stuff was so incredible. And people have talked about that a lot this offseason. So Jefferson, you have at 106. I have at 108. We both have Genty at 107. A good, but maybe not legendary season, a fantasy breaking type season. So he comes in for me as the RB3 behind Gibbs and Bijan, for you as the RB2, because you have 2 tight ends and 3 receivers going ahead of him. I've got 1 tight end and the 3 receivers, but we both have him at 7. I think it's pretty self-explanatory what that means for Genty. A lot of volume, right? Any rookie with his profile is going to stay in the first round as long as they get a ton of volume, even if the efficiency is not amazing. We saw it from Najee Harris a few years ago, was actually inefficient, but was still like a 111 pick the next year. And he had nowhere near the profile or draft capital of Genty coming in. So this is saying, yeah, Genty's definitely going to be up here again next year. And he's going to go up in ADP from where he is this year because he's going to look good and the Raiders offense is going to look good. We both have 2 Raiders in the top 7, but this is going to be a very concentrated Raiders offense this year. 108, you have CeeDee Lamb. I have him at 110. Another one where, look, he's got George Pickens there. Maybe the gap isn't quite as large. I'm thinking through that way. I want to know what you're thinking through, but we do have both of these guys, Jefferson and Lamb, a little bit further down than where they've been and where their talent level maybe is. You at 106 and 108, me at 108 and 110. Any thoughts on Jefferson and Lamb together? And then also probably let's rope Genty in that at 107.
Lamb is just very recently off of that 400-point season. And going here at wide receiver 2, he's definitely someone that I'm looking at basically as soon as Jahmyr Chase is gone. And so to say, I sort of want him at 102, 103, in part because for me, and we've discussed this on our main event streams, the 2-3 turn is more favorable for running backs. So there's a structural component to that. But then to say that, okay, next year he's going to be the wide receiver 8, how does that track? Part of it, again, is it's almost this Bijan Robinson argument where CeeDee Lamb doesn't have quite the size or quite the speed of, certainly of like a Calvin Johnson or a player like that, probably some of these other players. But one of the things when you go back through and look at him, even back to college, is that he was better than people think. He should have been probably like a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. Then he comes out and he's slower to establish, in part because the team that he was drafted onto had two big time scoring receivers. Now, in retrospect, they don't seem that great, but Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup were both coming off big seasons. He gets dropped into the mix there. He is the highest scoring of the three of them over the second half of his rookie year. He's one of these guys who breaks out, secondary breakout. You get the third breakout, that you get the 400-point season. Then you get, as you mentioned, this 2024 campaign where more or less the Cowboys just imploded. You have the quarterback injury, but they weren't playing very well before that. It makes it difficult for everything to work. The Cowboys are probably still a bit of a mess, but Dak Prescott probably positioned to bounce back. You now have a player who can give him his T. Higgins-ish sidekick. I think that the way that George Pickens works for him will be similar and probably slightly lesser than what Devontae Adams does for Nakua. I think that Adams is going to pull targets from Nakua and maybe not help as much. I don't think Nakua needed that. Certainly someone coming off of a 400 yards, a 400-point season, you say he doesn't need that either. I just think the space that CeeDee Lamb is running through is going to be so wide open when you have a George Pickens that his efficiency level is very high. The scoring is elite. People are going to look at that situation again next year after some of these other guys elevate and say, this is the approximate place to take him. And yet, if anything, Lamb is probably the pick that I feel the least comfortable with, having him all the way down there at 8. If you were to flip Lamb and Jefferson here in my 2026 projection, or even just move him ahead of Jetty, I would have no problem with that. The thing with Jefferson and
You
having him
just
up at
described
106
that you have
is
him. You just
I have him
described that you
too
have
low.
him yeah, incorrectly ranked, far too low.
Right. But the reason I have Jefferson where I have him is because I think that when you go into 2026, then people are going to say, okay, the team has figured out how to make Jefferson and Addison work off of each other so they're incredibly explosive. And that year 2 as a starter, obviously it's year 2 in the NFL for McCarthy, which I think is one of the reasons why people are okay with him, because having that year to sit does help, even if you were hurt. So he doesn't come in as a pure rookie trying to have to deal with everything, even all of the life things that you have to deal with when you're a rookie. This is your first year through. But it's his first year as the starter. In McCarthy's second year as a starter, I think people are going to say, this is full-blown Justin Jefferson. We're off to the races. I guess what I'm describing here is a top 8 that I think for 2026. And the problem that we always run into, you have some people get nicked up, you have quarterback injuries, you have really surprising busts. But it's so interesting and so exciting to see a 2026 future. And this is all part of this whole thing we've been talking about all summer, where we like the top 17 picks. But like a top 8 in 2026, where you're like, these are 8 guys that we could make a 101 case for. It gets me very excited about fantasy football.
And that is for you, Brock Bowers, Brian Thomas, Jamar Chase, Jahmyr Gibbs, Trey McBride, Justin Jefferson, Ashton Jeanty, CeeDee Lamb. I have 2 guys from that 8, not in my top 8. I already referenced McBride being probably one that I didn't think through well enough. The other one is Lamb, who I have at 110. I think I'm more concerned than you. I mean, I think I'm extremely high on Lamb, and I do think Pickens is very, very favorable for Lamb, and I do want to take him very high, but I think Pickens is going to be so dynamic and good in this passing game. It's still going to be very good for Lamb, but I think that people are going to look at it going into next year like Lamb is not the type of alpha, and that's, I think, the way the market thinks about it, as some of the other names that we've already discussed, which is probably not going to be fair. But I do think Lamb has not had a secondary wide receiver like Pickens, and it's not close. There's not been anything close to this. He was running with Brandon Cooks a couple of years ago. Last year, it was Jalen Tolbert. I mean, the tight ends have not been target earners. They also brought in Jaden Blue, who we like out of the backfield and is going to do some things on, on some pass plays out of the backfield. I think they're going to do some more stuff with Kevontae Turpin this year. I think it's going to be harder for Lamb to get to those really huge market share, targets per out run type numbers that make him really pop. And then people are going to lift up the hood and look at the way he progressed year over year. he had a really, really big 2023 in those types of numbers, but 2021, 2022, it kind of built up. It wasn't like amazing right from the jump like it was for Nabers last year, or it was for Chase, or it was for Jefferson, or it has been for a lot of these guys. It was very, very good. He had a lot of competition in that rookie year, as you mentioned, with Amari and Gallup. It built up. It came back a little bit last year. Still very strong. He's playing hurt. He's playing with terrible QBs. I think CeeDee Lamb is incredible. But I do think the market, even after a good year, is going to be a little bit more skeptical of him. That's why I have him at 10. You mentioned your big 8. The 2 guys that I have in my 8, Bowers, Gibbs, Bijan, Chase, Nabers, Brian Thomas, Genty, Jefferson, that you do not have. We already referenced Nabers. You have at 109. So you're taking him out of your top 8, but in part because of the injury. He would probably make it a top 9 for you if he wasn't hurt or banged up or there wasn't concern there. Bijan is the key difference, I think, in terms of the way we really view the player. I have Bijan way up at number 3 and think he's going to be good enough to warrant a top 5 pick next year. You referenced in talking about him some concern about the overall ceiling of the talent and that he's probably going to be looked more at like a 111 pick next year, which is not a bad ranking because of how strong this first round is going to be. So as we get to the back of the first round, it's probably not a surprise that there are a couple more of those wide receivers in this range. You have Puka Nacua at 110. I have him at 203. I have Nico Collins at 111. You have him at 202. So we have both those guys within 6 picks of each other on the turn, and they're making up one of these late spots. And then I have Lamb at 110. You have Bijan at 111. I just talked through the other differences. The other players that we have not referenced here, the player that I have ranked in the first round that you do not have ranked in the first round, I have at 109, ahead of Lamb, is Tetairoa McMillan. You have him at 206. You still have him incredibly high. Shawn, you said something about the Brock Bowers play being the most important of the preseason week 2. I've only watched a few of the games, but I think I'll probably feel this way even after I've watched all of them. On a 3rd and 8, on the series after Bryce Young left the game, and I don't think enough people were probably watching, Andy Dalton's in there. Tetairoa McMillan ran an out and up, a double move where his out pattern, he apparently sold enough of a vertical that Derek Stingley completely slipped. And then he overcorrected on the out, and McMillan burnt him by 2 steps. Derek Stingley, for anyone who doesn't know, was probably the best corner in football last year, if not right there. He was the highest paid corner in football until Sauce Gardner got his recent extension. Stingley, when he got paid, reset the AAV for cornerbacks by $5 million. Sauce Gardner got like a touch above Stingley. So as far as the way that the new contracts always beat the old ones, he's not currently the highest paid corner, but he's the one who pushed the position forward, and then Gardner got a very minor raise over the top of Stingley. Regardless, he's an upper echelon, top tier cornerback. Tet McMillan absolutely torched him, was 2 yards behind him, and Andy Dalton's arm got hit on the release. The ball fluttered into the air. Andy Dalton did the surrender cobra, put his hands on his head. Can't believe I missed that throw. Would have had a 55-yard touchdown. And for McMillan, Shawn, this is the thing that everybody freaked out about in April. He can't win vertically. And we talked about how it's probably more about the quarterbacks. He absolutely torched one of the best cornerbacks in the league in one-on-one coverage vertically for what could have been a huge touchdown. And instead, we didn't get that highlight. And so I don't know that it's actually going to get circulated. I tweeted it out today. Maybe it'll get circulated plenty. If he scores that 55-yard TD, his ADP jumps immediately because of that. More to the point, this is a player that we love because he was so dominant in the intermediate range that even without the pure vertical production, he was a back-to-back, whatever it was, 1,400-yard receiver, 3-year early declare with an incredible production profile. So far in the 2 preseason games, he has been targeted plenty. He has been out there. He's been the clear number 1 in this Dave Canales offense. There is not a level of competition. I'm talking about this target competition stuff because I do think the market is going to parse the wide receiver position with this many dynamic players at the top through that element, through target competition to some degree. I think McMillan is going to clearly be ahead. Like Xavier Legette to me is probably going to play himself out of a job this year with Jalen Coker, I think, taking over a little bit. Legette will play, but I'm not particularly high on him and where that's going to go. I think Coker is going to be a meaningful player down the stretch if he can, or down the line in his future if he can really develop. But that's a former UDFA that's going to be not too problematic for McMillan. I think, Shawn, that seeing him beat Stingley on that play and get vertical, and that potential for him to actually be a meaningful deep target, in addition to what his profile is in the intermediate ranges, I think he's going to have a monster rookie season. I've moved him up my rankings aggressively. I think at this point you can take him over a lot of the round 3 profiles that we don't necessarily love and haven't really been excited about taking. And I think next year he's going to be a top 10 overall pick.
Well, that's aggressive. And I love it. Absolutely love it.
Similar to how Malik Nabers went in this range after his rookie year. Garrett Wilson went in this range after his rookie year. Sorry, go ahead.
Keep going.
Puka Nacua went in this range after his rookie year. I could keep going forever.
One of the things that I think people don't fully understand with McMillan is the after catch brilliance as well, where he had the best evasion rate of all of the main Sayas had him for one of the best evasion rates in all of college football last season, above Travis Hunter, right? Well above guys like Jaden Higgins, Emeka Abuka. We were talking about 32% from McMillan, 12% for Abuka, 27. And in terms of what that actually means, we're talking about 27 tackles evaded, 13 broken tackles, 14 missed tackles combined, compared to 5 and 5 for Abuka, where people are talking about Abuka as a running back with the ball in his hands. Now, I'm not saying that Abuka isn't going to come out and look good, because I don't think that there's any reason to doubt all of the people, both from the team side and the observer side, who are saying that. But if we're going to think about Abuka in that way, a guy who is already on a college football field and again surrounded, because McMillan was the entire Arizona team last year. The team collapsed around him and he was able to do the things that he did. I just don't think the profile's understood that well, even though, how can it not be understood if he's going, in the middle of round 4? He's going ahead of guys like DK Metcalf and DJ Moore and Cortland Sutton, Jameson Williams, established guys who are already dynamic. So it's not like there's no love for McMillan. I am always trying to get people to stop all the rhetoric that you're putting out there and tweeting things out about how he should rise multiple rounds. Let's keep his ADP in check. But when you talk about the ceiling, and I have him, like you mentioned, at the 206 and behind a lot of other really good players, I think that the initial reaction for a lot of people will probably be like, yeah, we understand he's going to be good, and we understand there's not going to be target competition, and we understand that Bryce Young was good over the second half of last season, but you're putting him ahead of guys like Ceedee Lamb, Nico Collins. I think a lot of people right now, if they could get away with it, would just rank him at like the 102, 103. You've got him above Nico. You've got him ahead of Drake London, the guy that we think in some ways should be the betting favorite to lead the NFL in targets. And so when I say that there's a potential still lack of understanding of just how good McMillan's profile is, that's what I mean. It's not that people aren't drafting him pretty aggressively already.
Yeah, I love the pot calling the kettle black there about I can't raise the guy's ADP too much over here. Like, I'm pretty sure that reminded me of Jaden Blue, who I remember earlier in the offseason we were talking about, and he kept telling me he didn't really think it was going to work out for him. And then a few months later, read a whole big piece about Jaden Blue. I think Shawn just wants me to keep his ADP down so he can be the one to steam it up in a week. He's got a piece of the hopper on McMillan, I'm sure. No, I mean, I think this is very justifiable against guys like Lamb and Nico and London going into next year because of the way that this is a market exercise and because of the way that the market looks at a year two guy and what kind of development he can have. McMillan's going to be so good as a rookie that he's going to have the type of hype that Brian Thomas has right now, that Malik Nabers has right now. I genuinely think that we're going to be going into next year and he's going to be the clear number one, and everyone doing projections is going to be like his year two ascension is going to be even bigger than what we saw in year one because he so dominated the volume and the production in this passing game in year one. You've been really high on Bryce Young and on this passing game still being able to be very effective, and I do think they are going to be. They had a tough couple series in the second preseason game, but I think Canals is a good coach and they're going to work things out there. I think it's kind of a no-brainer that if Lamb has a little bit of a disappointing season relative to his own ceiling because of George Pickens, that the market will be like, yeah, the year two guy is the guy I want to take over that. They get bored of the old thing fairly quickly. My issue with Nico as well, who I actually did rank higher than you, comes down to a similar point where you have Christian Kirk there, who's I think not nothing, and then two impactful day two rookie wide receivers. And I do think Higgins is going to hit, but even if he doesn't, then maybe Noel hits. One of those guys is probably going to look like a year two guy that's somewhat meaningful to Nico's volume proposition in 2026. And so that's why I had McMillan ahead of Lamb and Nico, was just sort of thinking through the ways that projections weigh into these things and how people are going to think about year over year progressions. It's not necessarily saying that McMillan's going to score more raw points than CeeDee Lamb this year, but that's not what drives ADP every year, right? That's not exactly the way that it always works out. And so I do have McMillan at 9, Lamb at 10, Nico at 11. So I did the top 8s a second ago. That's my 9, 10, 11. Yours is Nabers, Puka, and Bijan. We'll save Puka for the round 2 show because we are on a little bit of a time crunch on these episodes today. But we do have to talk about the guy we both have at 112.
Despite both having him at 112, even though we've done more than 12 players, I mean, this is the ultimate time to break it and say, you got to listen to the second episode.
All right. The number 12 is a tease for episode 2. We've always done a recap of the first round at the end of the show. Shawn's first round is Brock Bowers, Brian Thomas Jr., Jamar Chase, Jahmyr Gibbs, Trey McBride, Justin Jefferson, Ashton Jeanty, CeeDee Lamb, Malik Nabers, Puka Nacua, Bijan Robinson, and mystery player X, who does not have an ADP in the first 2 rounds here in 2025. My top 10, Brock Bowers, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, Jamar Chase, Malik Nabers, Brian Thomas Jr., Ashton Jeanty, Justin Jefferson, Tetairoa, McMillan, CeeDee Lamb, Nico Collins, and again, mystery player X. We have talked a lot more than 12 players. The guys that you ranked in the top 11 that I did not. Trey McBride, you had him at 105. I have him at 201. Puka Nacua, you have at 110. I have him at 203. The guys that I ranked that you did not in the top 10 include Tetairoa and McMillan, who I had at 109. You have at 206. That's one of our bigger gaps. You're a little bit further down on him. You have multiple receivers, another little tease, multiple receivers ahead of him in the early part of round 2 for tomorrow's show. And then Nico Collins, I had at 111. You have at 202. Very close with Puka and Nico, just sort of flip-flopping those guys back of the first, start of the second. But that is where we stand through one round with a mystery box at the 112. We're breaking our own rules. That's the big tease reveal for the next episode.
Ben, this will be Stealing Bananas, the big show, the 26th first round show. Ben has mentioned $19.99 for the massive draft kit, all of the rankings, everything that he does, so much there in August. I suggest you subscribe to him for the full year. You'll be sorry that if you don't. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Coupon code there's RV Radio 2025 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year sub. Also, we did a recent Reddit AMA, which Ben, I don't really know how the internet works, but I'm assuming people can still find. And in the intro to that, there is an SB specific coupon code for a 1-year sub to RotoViz. If you're looking for that, you can get it there. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.